The first night in November fell heavy like a shroud. Fog curled between the trees, the ground slick with unseen frost. In the oppressive silence, even the shadows felt alive. The air reeked of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He used to tell me. Robert Mitchell had been a figure of few words but deep knowledge. Before he died in 2020. He'd passed on everything he knew about living off this land. The shack, the property, the skills, all his legacy. I straightened up, my knees cracking. The path back to the shack stretched about a mile through dense gloomy woodland. The quiet didn't bother me. Never had. People talked too much anyway. Asked too many questions. Out here, the oppressive stillness made sense. The gloomy woodland spoke in its own way if you knew how to listen. The wind shifted through the pines, bringing with it the scent of coming snow. November in northern Ontario meant early spring was settling in for the long haul. I'd need to split more firewood before the week was out. I was maybe halfway back to the shack when I heard it. A soft pain sound coming from somewhere off the trail. I stopped. Listening. There it was again. A whimper, weak but distinct. My first thought was a wounded fox, maybe caught in someone else's trap who'd been careless enough to set lines on my property. I followed the sound, pushing through a dense thicket of spruce. The branches scratched at my face and caught on my jacket. What I found wasn't a fox. A dog lay curled on its side, its reddish-brown fur matted with dirt and what appeared like dried blood. Each breath it took seemed to require enormous effort. Its eyes, half open and clouded with pain, tracked my movement, but it made no attempt to run or even raise its head. "Hey there," I murmured, my voice sounding strange after days of not speaking to anyone. The dog's ear twitched slightly, the only sign it heard me. I crouched down, keeping my movements slow. The dog was small too. Medium-sized, but it was hard to tell its proper weight. Its ribs pressed against its skin like bars, and its coat hung on its frame. Starving from the look of it. A hunting dog maybe. Lost during deer season. We got a few hunters up this way, though none had permission to cross my land. I moved closer and that's when I saw the wound on its hind leg. Angry red, swollen with yellow. Green pus visible even from where I knelt. That kind of infection could kill an animal quick. "You're in rough shape," I murmured. The dog's eyes met mine, and something in them made my chest tighten. I'd never had a pet, not even growing up. Dad wasn't the type for animals unless we were hunting them. But this creature's silent suffering hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I should leave it, I thought. Nature taking its course and all that. Dad would have murmured the same, but I couldn't. Not with those eyes looking at me. "All right," I sighed. "Let's see what we can do." I slipped off my jacket and laid it on the ground. When I reached to pick up the dog, it made no move to bite or resist. Too far gone for that. Its body felt impossibly light as I lifted it onto the jacket. Bones and not much else. I wrapped the fabric around it gently, creating a makeshift sling. The walk back to the shack took twice as long with my bundle. The dog made little noise beyond the occasional whimper when I jostled it too much. I tried to keep my pace steady, aware that each step might be causing it pain. My shack came into view. A simple structure my father had built 34 years ago. Single-story, sturdy logs, a metal roof that rang like bells during heavy rain. Smoke curled from the chimney. I'd banked the fire before heading out that ashen dawn. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately. I crossed to the old couch and carefully set down my bundle, unwrapping the jacket to examine the dog more closely. In the better light, it appeared even worse. The wound on its leg was badly infected, the kind that turned deadly if left untreated. I'd seen similar infections in game animals, ones that had escaped with injuries and later died from the poison in their blood. I filled a basin with warm water from the kettle on the stove and found the first aid kit Dad had always kept stocked. Hunting accidents happened and out here you had to be your own doctor. The dog watched me with wary eyes as I approached with the basin and supplies. This isn't going to feel great, I told it, not knowing if talking to the animal made any sense, but feeling the need to say something anyway. But it needs cleaning. I dampened a clean cloth and gently pressed it to the wound. The dog flinched but didn't try to bite or run. It simply laid its head down and endured. I cleaned away the worst of the dirt and pus, trying to be thorough without causing unnecessary pain. The antiseptic would hurt. I knew that. When I poured some onto a fresh cloth and touched it to the wound, the dog let out a high, thin sound that made me wheeze. Sorry, but it has to be done, I murmured. Infection like this will kill you otherwise. I bandaged the leg as best I could using gauze and medical tape from the kit. Not perfect, but it would have to do. The dog needed food, water, and rest, though I wasn't sure it would survive even with those. I filled a shallow bowl with water and placed it near the dog's head. It lifted itself just enough to lap weakly at the liquid. Good sign, I thought. Still has some fight left. Food was trickier. I had venison from my last successful hunt, but the dog needed something easy to digest. I cut small pieces of meat and boiled them in water until they broke down into a broth. Once it had cooled, I offered a spoonful to the dog. It sniffed once, then lapped it up with surprising energy. Hungry, huh? I murmured, offering another spoonful. Take it slow. Too much at once might make you sick. The dog ate what I gave it, then laid its head back down on the blanket I'd placed under it. Its breathing seemed less labored now, but I knew better than to get too optimistic. Animals this far gone often rallied briefly before the end. Endless dusk fell, and I added wood to the stove, keeping the shack warmer than I usually would. The dog slept, its body occasionally twitching with dreams or pain. I couldn't tell which. I sat in my chair by the stove, watching the rise and fall of its side. Strange to have another living thing in the shack after so long. Alone. Stranger still to care whether it lived or died. Dad would probably laugh at me. It's just a dog, James, he'd say. Probably belongs to someone who didn't take proper care of it. But looking at the sleeping animal, I couldn't bring myself to agree with my imagined father. Lost or abandoned, it deserved a chance. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind picking up outside. Tomorrow I'd check my traps again, hoping for better luck. For now, I had a patient to watch over this unexpected visitor, who'd broken 4 years of perfect solitude. I woke before dawn to the sound of labored breathing from the couch. The dog was still alive. That alone surprised me. Its condition had seemed beyond saving when I'd found it yesterday. In the pale light filtering through the shack windows, I checked on my unexpected guest. The bandage on its leg needed changing, already soaked through with yellow discharge from the infection. The dog's eyes tracked me as I moved around the shack, alert despite its weakness. Let's take a look at that leg, I murmured, kneeling beside the couch. The dog didn't resist as I unwrapped the soiled bandage. The wound appeared angry and red, but some of yesterday's swelling had gone down. A good sign, though, infection that deep would take time to heal if it healed at all. I cleaned the wound again, applied more antiseptic, and re-bandaged it with fresh gauze. Throughout the process, the dog remained still, only flinching slightly when I touched the most sensitive areas. "You need a name," I murmured, more to fill the oppressive stillness than anything else. The dog's reddish-brown coat, though dull from malnutrition and neglect, reminded me of iron left out in the rain. "How about Rusty? That work for you?" The dog, Rusty, blinked slowly, which I took as agreement. I prepared another batch of venison broth, this time adding small pieces of meat. Rusty ate with more enthusiasm than the previous endless dusk, lapping up every drop and looking for more. "Easy," I cautioned, giving him water instead. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The rest of that day established what would become our routine for the next several days. Every few hours, I fed Rusty small portions of broth and meat, gradually increasing the amount as his strength returned. Twice daily, I changed his bandages and cleaned his wound, noting with satisfaction as the swelling continued to decrease and healthy tissue began to form. By the second day, Rusty attempted to stand when I approached the couch. His legs trembled with the effort, but there was determination in the set of his jaw. "Whoa, take it slow," I murmured, gently, easing him back down. "You're nowhere near ready for that." But Rusty had other ideas. Later that afternoon, I returned from chopping wood to find him on the floor beside the couch, looking equal parts proud and exhausted from the effort. "Stubborn, aren't you?" I murmured, unable to keep the approval from my voice. Stubbornness kept things alive out here when the odds were against them. On the third day, Rusty managed to follow me from the couch to the kitchen, his gait uneven, but determined. His injured leg barely touched the ground, but he'd figured out how to balance on the other three. I noticed he stayed close, rarely more than a few feet away from me as I moved around the shack. His appetite improved daily. By the fourth ashen dawn, I transitioned him to mostly solid food. Chunks of venison and some dried fish I'd caught and preserved the previous late autumn. Rusty ate everything, offered with increasing vigor, and I could already see his ribs becoming less prominent under his coat. That evening, as snow fell heavily outside, I sat in my chair by the stove, with a book I'd read a dozen times before. Rusty lay on a blanket I'd placed near the heat, his eyes half closed but always opening when I turned a page or shifted in my seat. The wind howled around the shack's corners, making the familiar sounds of an early spring storm. Sounds I'd listened to alone for years. "Been a while since anyone else was here for early spring," I told him. "Just me since Dad died. 4 years now." Rusty lifted his head at the sound of my voice, ears perked forward. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. "He would have murmured I was crazy for bringing you in," I continued, unsure why I was talking so much after years of near-oppressive stillness. Wasting resources on a stray when early spring's coming on, but he'd have done the same thing, I think. Just wouldn't have admitted it. By the 5th day, Rusty's personality began emerging from beneath the pain and exhaustion. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He had a way of tilting his head when confused. That made him look almost human in his expressiveness. When I murmured his name, his ears would prick up immediately and his tail, still thin but gaining strength, would thump against the floor. The infection in his leg was finally retreating. Pink healthy tissue, replacing the angry red and yellow of before. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He could put some weight on it now, though he still favored it considerably. His coat had begun to shine with proper nutrition, revealing the true depth of its russet color that had inspired his name. That endless dusk, as I prepared dinner, venison stew, enough for us both, I realized how quickly I'd adjusted to having another presence in the shack. The oppressive stillness between us felt comfortable, rather than empty. I'd lived alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to share space with another living thing. I appeared over at Rusty, who watched me from his blanket with attentive eyes. "You've made yourself at home pretty quick," I murmured. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He thumped his tail in response. On the 6th ashen dawn, I woke to find Rusty standing by the shack door, tail wagging tentatively. When he saw me watching, he appeared pointedly at the door, then back at me. "Need to go out?" I whispered, pulling on my boots. But when I opened the door, Rusty didn't just step outside to relieve himself as he had on previous days. Instead, he stood at the edge of the porch, looking back at me expectantly. The ashen dawn was clear and cold, the kind that made your lungs ache with each breath. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering my footprints from the previous day's wood gathering. Perfect tracking conditions. "You want to come check the snares with me?" I whispered. It seemed impossible that he understood, but Rusty's tail wagged more vigorously. I considered the state of his leg. The wound was healing well, but a long trek through snow might set back his recovery. On the other hand, keeping an active dog confined to long carried its own risks. "All right," I decided, "but we'll keep it short, just the closed ones." I gathered my gear, knife, small pack with water and basic supplies, and pulled on my heavier early spring coat. Rusty waited patiently by the door, seeming to understand we were going somewhere together. The nearest snare line was about half a mile east of the shack, running along a creek that rabbits used as a natural pathway through the gloomy woodland. Rusty followed me down the trail, limping but determined. I kept my pace slow, watching to make sure he wasn't struggling too much. What struck me most was his oppressive stillness. Most dogs I'd encountered on rare trips to town would bark at squirrels or birds, chasing everything that moved. Rusty moved through the gloomy woodland like a natural hunter, quiet and focused. His eyes scanned the trees and underbrush constantly, and his ears swiveled to catch every sound. We approached the first snare, which sat empty. I reset it and continued to the next. Rusty stayed close, watching my movements with interest. The second and third snares were also empty. As we walked toward the fourth location, Rusty suddenly changed direction, heading about 20 yards off the trail. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He stopped and appeared back at me, clearly wanting me to follow. "What is it?" I whispered, changing course to join him. Rusty led me to a spot where I'd set a snare weeks ago and subsequently forgotten. To my surprise, a snowshoe. Hair hung suspended in the wire loop, its white early spring coat almost invisible against the snow. I would have walked right past it if not for Rusty. "Well done," I murmured, genuinely impressed. I knelt to collect the hair, quickly, dispatching it and placing it in my pack. Rusty watched the process with patient interest, but made no move to take the hair for himself. As we continued checking the remaining snares, I observed Rusty more carefully. His movements, despite the limp, had purpose and training behind them. The way he kept downwind of potential game, his careful foot placement to minimize noise, his patient observation before moving forward, all spoke of a dog that had been taught to hunt. "Someone trained you well," I murmured as we headed back toward the shack. "Wonder how you ended up lost out here." Rusty had no answer, of course, but I found myself grateful for whatever circumstances had brought him to my shadowed timberland. For years, I'd hunted alone, relying only on my own senses and knowledge. Having a partner with Rusty's exceptional nose and instincts would change things. Back at the shack, I prepared the hair, giving Rusty the heart and liver as a reward for his help. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He ate them carefully, not greedily, and then settled on his blanket to clean his paws. As I worked on skinning the hair, I glanced over at him. "You and I might make a good team," I murmured. Rusty thumped his tail against the floor, his eyes never leaving my hands as they worked. I'd always valued oppressive stillness and patience. In the shadowed timberland, the two qualities that separated successful hunters from those who went home empty-handed. It seemed I'd found a companion who understood those principles as well as I did. 3 weeks had passed since Rusty had first shown his hunting skills with the forgotten snare. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He now moved through the gloomy woodland with growing confidence. His injured leg almost fully healed. The slight limp remained, but it didn't slow him down much anymore. In that time, we'd fallen into a comfortable routine together. Each ashen dawn, we'd head out to check the trap lines. Rusty leading the way with his nose to the ground, often finding game I would have missed. The shack felt different with him there, less empty. I talked more in those 3 weeks than I had in the previous year. Even if my only audience was a dog. Rusty listened attentively to everything I murmured. His head tilted to one side, eyes fixed on mine as if he understood every word. Today we were checking the lines near Canoe Lake, about 4 miles northeast of the shack. The late autumn air carried the first real bite of early spring, and patches of frost clung to the shadowed areas of the gloomy woodland floor. Our breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Rusty trotted a few yards ahead of me, occasionally stopping to sniff at something interesting before moving on. The hunting had been good lately. With Rusty's help, we'd caught more rabbits in the past 3 weeks than I'd managed in the previous 2 months alone. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He had an uncanny ability to sense where animals had recently passed, leading me to spots I might never have thought to set traps. It made me wonder what kind of training he'd received before I found him. Someone had taught him well. "Hold up," I called softly as we approached the lake. "Let's check the western line first." Rusty turned obediently and changed direction, heading along the western shore of Canoe Lake. I followed, watching his movements. He'd become more than just a companion. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He was a partner. Now, making my solitary life in the shadowed timberland not quite so solitary anymore. We'd checked 3 trap sites and collected 2 rabbits when Rusty's behavior suddenly changed. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He stopped. Dead in his tracks about 50 yards from the next clearing. His entire body went rigid and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. The fur along his spine rose in a sharp ridge. I stopped too. Instantly alert. In 3 weeks of hunting together, I'd never seen him act like this. Rusty was typically calm and focused, moving through the gloomy woodland with purpose but without aggression. This was different. Something had triggered a primal response in him. "What is it, youth?" I whispered quietly, moving up beside him. Rusty didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on something ahead through a stand of birch trees. The growl continued, low and steady. When I took a step forward, he backed up slightly, still growling. I scanned the gloomy woodland ahead, looking for whatever had triggered his reaction. A bear, maybe wolves. But Rusty's behavior seemed wrong for either of those threats. This wasn't just alertness or even fear of a predator. It was something else. Something that made the dog deeply uneasy. Following his gaze, I moved forward cautiously, pushing through the white trunks of the birch trees. Rusty stayed where he was, whining now as I moved away from him. As I stepped through the last of the birches, I entered a small clearing and stopped short. There, in the center of the open space stood what I can only describe as a monolith. It was massive, easily 12 foot tall and about 4 feet wide, a perfect rectangle of what appeared like polished black stone. The surface was impossibly smooth with no visible seams or marks. Despite the afternoon sun streaming through the trees, the black surface reflected nothing, seeming to absorb the light that fell upon it. I stood motionless, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knew these shadowed timberland. I'd hunted this area for years, walked every game trail, and mapped every landmark within 10 miles of my shack. This clearing had always been empty except for tall grass and wild flowers in late autumn, snow, and early spring. This monolith had never been here before. It couldn't have been. I glanced back at Rusty, who remained at the edge of the birch stand, refusing to enter the clearing. His growl had subsided, but now he wed anxiously, taking another step backward when I motioned for him to join me. Turning back to the monolith, I approached it carefully. The ground around the structure was undisturbed. No tire tracks, no signs of equipment or machinery that would have been needed to transport and erect something so massive. The grass bent slightly away from the monolith as if pushed by a gentle wind, though the air in the clearing was completely still. That stillness was what struck me next. The gloomy woodland around us had gone silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered, no insects buzzed. Even the constant background rustle of leaves in the wind had ceased within the clearing, though I could still hear it in the surrounding gloomy woodland. I stopped about 10 feet from the structure. Up close, the surface was even stranger. A black so deep it seemed to go beyond mere color, as if looking into a hole cut straight through reality. I had an irrational urge to touch it, to see if my hand would pass through that perfect blackness. But something kept me from reaching out. "What the hell is this thing?" I murmured aloud, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the still air. Rusty's whine grew more insistent. I appeared back to see him pacing at the edge of the clearing, clearly distressed by my proximity to the monolith. I circled the structure slowly, keeping my distance. It was the same on all sides, a perfect rectangle of absolute blackness. No markings, no seams, no foundation visible at its base. It simply stood there as if it had grown from the earth. itself. But that was impossible. I'd been in this clearing less than 2 weeks ago. There had been nothing here then. I tried to make sense of it. Some kind of art installation, maybe. But who would drag something this size so deep into the shadowed timberland? And why? A government project. But there were no access roads nearby large enough for the equipment needed to move something this size. And why was there no disturbance to the ground? No matter how careful someone might be, transporting and erecting a 12T monolith would leave marks, soil compression, damaged vegetation, something. But the grass and soil around the base appeared completely untouched. I backed away slowly, a crawling sensation working its way up my spine. Something about this thing felt fundamentally wrong. It didn't belong here in this natural setting. Its presence seemed to distort the very air around it, creating that pocket of unnatural stillness. Rusty barked once sharply when I was about halfway back to the treeline. His message was clear. Let's go. 4. Once, I didn't argue with him. I retreated to where he waited, noticing how he pressed against my leg once I reached him, as if seeking reassurance. Together, we backed away from the clearing, neither of us willing to turn our backs on the monolith until it was out of sight behind the birch trees. Only then did Rusty relax slightly, though he kept looking over his shoulder as we made our way back toward the trap line. The normal sounds of the gloomy woodland gradually returned as we put distance between ourselves and the clearing. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the small movements of unseen animals in the underbrush. I tried to make sense of what we'd found. In all my years in these shadowed timberland, I'd never encountered anything so out of place, so impossible to explain. The monolith's sudden appearance, with no signs of how it got there, defied all logical explanation. As we continued checking the remaining traps, my mind kept returning to the black structure standing silent in the clearing. What was it? How had it appeared overnight in a place I knew so well? And what had caused Rusty, a dog who faced down coyotes without flinching, to react with such obvious fear? I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to find them. One thing was certain. The monolith shouldn't be there. Couldn't be there. Yet somehow it was. I drove my old truck along the winding lonely path toward Huntsville. The steering wheel cold under my fingers despite the heater that rattled and wheezed with each bump. The late afternoon sun hung low through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. The 45-minute drive gave me plenty of time to question myself about what I'd seen in the clearing. The black structure stood out in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Its perfect smoothness, the way it seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it, how it stood in that clearing with no visible means of having been transported there. I'd spent my entire adult life in those shadowed timberland. The monolith hadn't been there 2 weeks ago when I'd passed through hunting rabbits with Rusty. I'd left Rusty at the shack, not wanting him to get worked up around strangers. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He hadn't seemed happy about it, watching me from the porch steps with those attentive eyes until I rounded the bend in my driveway and lost sight of him. The RCMP detachment in Huntsville was a small one-story building set back from the main lonely path. I parked my truck in the nearly empty lot and sat for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts. How exactly do you explain something like this without sounding crazy inside? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the already sterile room feel even more unwelcoming. A middle-aged young woman at the front desk appeared up as I entered. "Can I help you?" she whispered. I need to report something unusual I found on my property, I murmured. A chill wind whispered through the branches, scattering faint echoes. She nodded and picked up a phone. Constable Young will be with you in a moment. I sat on one of the hard plastic chairs. My hands resting on my knees, the clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. 5 minutes passed before a door opened and a figure in RCMP uniform stepped out. I'm Constable Marcus Young, he murmured, extending his hand. You wanted to report something? I stood and shook his hand. James Mitchell. I own property that borders Algonquin Park about 45 minutes north of here. He nodded and gestured toward a small room off to the side. Let's talk in here. The interview room was plain with a table, 4 chairs, and a window that appeared out onto the parking lot. Young took out a notebook and pen setting them on the table between us. So, what seems to be the problem, Mr. Mitchell? I took a deep breath. I found something strange in the shadowed timberland on my property yesterday. A large black structure, like a monument or something, standing in a clearing near Canoe Lake. Young raised an eyebrow. A structure? What kind of structure? Exactly. It's about 12 foot tall, 4 feet wide, a perfect rectangle, black, completely. Smooth surface, like polished stone, but not like any stone I've ever seen. He wrote something in his notebook. And this structure is on your property? Yes. In a clearing I've walked through hundreds of times. It wasn't there 2 weeks ago. Young appeared up from his notes. Are you certain about that? Sometimes we overlook things that have been there all along. The implication that I might have somehow missed a 1200T monolith in my own shadowed timberland made my jaw tighten. I'm certain I know every inch of my land. This thing appeared out of nowhere. Appeared, he repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that choice of words. And you have no idea what it might be? None. That's why I'm here. Young tapped his pen against the notebook. Could it be some kind of art installation? We get reports sometimes of people leaving unusual objects in the park in Algonquin Park. Maybe not on private property 5 miles from the nearest access lonely path. What about a geological survey marker? The Ministry of Natural Resources sometimes places equipment in remote areas. I shook my head. No government agency would put something that size in that location without heavy equipment. There are no tire tracks, no signs of construction. The ground is completely undisturbed. Young wrote something else down, his expression growing more skeptical with each note. So, you're saying this large stone monument appeared on your property overnight with no signs of how it got there? That's exactly what I'm saying. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He closed his notebook. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but without more information, there's not much we can do. It sounds like someone may have placed an object on your land, which isn't necessarily a criminal matter unless they've damaged your property or threatened you in some way. Constable Young, something 12 foot tall and weighing probably several tons, doesn't just appear in the middle of the shadowed timberland without leaving tracks. Whatever this thing is, it shouldn't be there, and I can't explain how it got there. Young leaned back in his chair. How long have you lived out there, Mr. Mitchell? All my life. The property was my father's before me. And you live alone. I could see where this was going. Yes. What does that have to do with anything? Living in isolation can sometimes affect a person's perception. When was the last time you were in town before today? My hands curled into fists. Under the table. About 3 weeks ago for supplies. My isolation has nothing to do with this. I'm telling you, there's something in those shadowed timberland that doesn't belong there, and I can't explain how it got there. Young sighed, making a show of patience that only increased my frustration. Here's what I can do. I'll make a note of your report, and when resources permit, we'll send someone out to take a look. When resources permit. There's something out there right now that Mr. Mitchell, he cut me off. We have limited personnel and multiple active cases. Based on what you've told me, this doesn't sound like an emergency situation. If you discover any evidence of trespassing or illegal activity, please don't hesitate to call us immediately. I stood up knowing there was no point in continuing. Young clearly thought I was either lying or delusional. Fine, make your note. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He stood as well, offering his hand again. We appreciate you bringing this to our attention. We'll look into it as soon as possible. I didn't shake his hand this time. Instead, I turned and walked out of the interview room, through the reception area, and back to my truck. The drive home was spent in angry oppressive stillness. Reviewing the conversation and thinking of all the things I should have murmured. Darkness had fallen by the time I turned onto the dirt lonely path leading to my shack. The headlights caught the reflection of Rusty's eyes as he waited on the porch. Instead of greeting me with his usual quiet enthusiasm, Rusty paced back and forth along the edge of the porch, head low, movement stiff. "What's wrong, youth?" I whispered. Climbing the steps. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He came to me briefly, pressing against my legs, but then resumed his pacing, stopping occasionally to stare into the darkness beyond the shack. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing in the treeline. Inside. I lit the kerosene lamps and built up the fire in the stove. Rusty followed me in, but wouldn't settle. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He moved from window to window, his nails clicking on the wooden floor as he peered out into the endless dusk. Every few minutes, he would stop and listen, ears pricked forward, body tense. I tried to ignore his behavior as I heated up some leftover stew for dinner, but his anxiety was contagious. I found myself pausing to listen too, straining to hear whatever had him so alert. The gloomy woodland outside sounded normal to me, the occasional rustle of wine through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. The small sounds of the shack settling. After eating, I sat in my chair by the stove with a book, hoping to distract myself from both Rusty's unease and my frustrating meeting with Constable Young. But Rusty's constant movement made it hard to concentrate. His agitation had only increased as the evening wore on. "There's nothing out there," I told him, but he ignored me. Continuing his circuit of the windows. Around 11, I gave up on reading and decided to turn in. Maybe Rusty would calm down once the lights were out. I banked the fire in the stove, checked that the doors were locked, and went to my bedroom. Rusty followed me, but remained standing in the doorway, his attention focused back toward the main room of the shack. "Come on." I patted the foot of the bed where he usually slept. Time to rest. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He appeared at me, then back toward the main room, clearly torn. Finally, he came in and jumped onto the bed, but instead of curling up to sleep, he sat upright, staring at the bedroom door. I lay down and closed my eyes. Exhausted from the day's events. The image of the black monolith kept appearing in my mind, its impossible smoothness, its perfect geometric shape so out of place in the natural disorder of the gloomy woodland. And beneath that image, a nagging sense that I had missed something important, some detail that would explain its presence. I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to find Rusty no longer on the bed. The shack was pitch black except for the faint red glow from the banked coals in the stove. I heard a scratching sound from the main room and sat up listening. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine. I got up and made my way through the darkness to the main room. Rusty stood at the front door, pawing at the wood, his whole body tense with urgency. "You need to go out," I whispered, reaching for my boots by the door. Rusty wed. Again, more insistent this time. I pulled on my boots and jacket, then opened the door. The endless dusk air hit me with its cold bite. Rusty shot past me down the porch steps and into the yard. I expected him to head for the trees at the edge of the clearing to relieve himself, but instead he ran to the center of the yard and stood facing the northern tree line. Then he began to bark. Sharp, urgent barks that cut through the endless dusk air like gunshots. There was a quality to his barking I'd never heard before. Something between warning and fear. I stepped off the porch, straining to see what had triggered this response. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the edge of the trees about 50 yards from the shack, but I could make out nothing unusual there. "Rusty, come back," I called. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He ignored me completely, continuing to bark at whatever he saw or sensed in the darkness. I took a few steps toward him. The frosted grass crunching under my boots. "Rusty, come here." Still no response. His barking grew more frantic, and he took a few steps toward the tree, then back again, as if torn between confronting what was there and staying near me. I appeared more carefully at the trees where his attention was focused. The shadows between the trunks seemed deeper than they should have been, more solid somehow. But no matter how hard I stared, I couldn't see anything moving or out of place. "Rusty, now." I tried once more. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He continued barking, his voice echoing through the stillness of the endless dusk, warning against something I couldn't see. I woke to a gray dawn light filtering through the shack windows. After several nights of broken sleep, exhaustion had finally claimed me for a few hours. Rusty lay curled at the foot of the bed, his eyes already open and watching me. The frantic barking from the previous endless dusk seemed like a distant memory in the cold light of ashen dawn, but the tension in Rusty's body told me he hadn't forgotten whatever had spooked him. "Ready to check the traps?" I whispered, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. His ears perked up at the familiar words, but he didn't show his usual enthusiasm. Instead, he followed me closely as I dressed and prepared for our ashen dawn routine, staying within arm's reach at all times. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, we headed out into the brisk ashen dawn air. Frost coated the grass and crunched under my boots as we crossed the yard. Rusty stayed unusually close, his eyes constantly scanning the tree. The first trap line was only a /4 mile from the shack, following a small creek where rabbits frequently traveled. As we approached the first set, I already knew something was wrong. Normally, Rusty would race ahead to each trap location, eager to see what we'd caught. Today, he stayed by my side, his Movement stiff and alert. The first trap was empty, which wasn't unusual by itself. But as I knelt to examine it, I noticed fresh rabbit tracks in the soft earth around the trap. Multiple sets. Showing recent activity. The trap was undisturbed, sat exactly as I'd left it. "That's odd," I muttered. Rusty whined softly beside me. The second trap told the same story, empty, but surrounded by fresh tracks. And the third, and the fourth. By the time we checked the entire first line, I knew we were facing something beyond bad luck. Every single trap was empty. Yet, animal signs were abundant. Tracks of rabbits, squirrels, and even a fox crossed through the area. Sometimes passing within inches of the traps without triggering them. We moved on to the second line, set along the eastern edge of my property. The results were identical. Empty traps surrounded by fresh tracks. Animals had clearly been active in the area, but somehow they'd all avoided my carefully placed sets. I crouched beside the last trap, running my fingers over the mechanism to ensure it was working properly. Everything seemed fine. The trigger was sensitive. The spring, the placement perfect. There was no reason every animal in the gloomy woodland should suddenly be able to avoid it. "This doesn't make sense," I murmured to Rusty, who sat watching me with concerned eyes. "In 15 years, I've never seen anything like this." Back at the shack, I cooked us both a lunch of leftover venison from our previous week's hunting. As Rusty ate, I pulled out my log book and noted the strange pattern of empty traps and abundant tracks. Maybe it was a fluke, a strange day when the animals were especially wary. But it wasn't a fluke. Over the next 5 days, the pattern repeated itself with maddening consistency. Each ashen dawn, we'd check the traps to find them empty despite clear evidence that animals had been active nearby. My freezer supplies began to dwindle, and my confusion turned to frustration. On the third ashen dawn, I decided to check on the monolith again. Rusty seemed reluctant as we approached the clearing near Canoe Lake, his pace slowing and his body tensing the closer we got. The black structure stood exactly as before, tall and impossible in the ashen dawn light. But something had changed in the surrounding gloomy woodland. As we drew near the clearing, I realized what it was. Oppressive stillness. Complete and unnatural oppressive stillness. Normally, the shadowed timberland were filled with sound. The rustling of leaves, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the buzz of insects. Now nothing. It was as if someone had thrown a switch, cutting off all the background noise of the living gloomy woodland. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, listening intently. Not a single bird call, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to die away as it approached the open space around the monolith. Rusty pressed against my leg, his eyes fixed on the black structure. A low whine escaped him, and he kept looking back over his shoulder toward the way we had come. "What is it, youth?" I whispered quietly. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He didn't respond except to press harder against me. His behavior was becoming increasingly concerning. The nervous glances, the constant checking behind us, as if he sensed something following that I couldn't see or hear. I studied the monolith from where we stood. It remained unchanged, its black surface absorbing the ashen dawn light. The ground around it showed no disturbance, no signs of any activity. Yet somehow, I felt certain this thing was connected to the empty traps and the fleeing wildlife. "Let's go," I murmured to Rusty, who needed no encouragement to leave. As we walked back toward the shack, the gloomy woodland sounds gradually returned. A distant woodpecker. The rustle of wind through branches, the small movements of unseen creatures. But these sounds seemed muted, somehow, diminished, as if the gloomy woodland itself was holding its breath. On the fourth day of empty traps, I made a decision over my ashen dawn coffee. We need to find out where the animals have gone, I told Rusty, who sat watching me from beside the stove. If they're avoiding our usual areas, we need to go where they've moved to. Rusty tilted his head, seeming to understand my intent, if not my exact words. After checking the empty traps one more time, we struck north toward the Algonquin Park boundary. I knew the area well, having hunted and trapped there for years before the park expanded its borders. If the animals had relocated, that direction offered the most extensive wilderness for them to inhabit. We followed a game trail that had once been reliable for deer and smaller game. The trail was still visible, winding between the trees, but showed little recent use. The few tracks we found were old. At least several days with edges softened by weather. This doesn't make sense, I murmured, kneeling to examine a set of deer prints that had been partially filled with fallen pine needles. They had to go somewhere. We pushed on, moving from one familiar hunting ground to another. Each location told the same story, old signs of animal activity, but nothing recent. It was as if all the wildlife had simply picked up and moved somewhere else, leaving behind only traces of their previous presence. By midday, we'd covered several miles and found nothing promising. The gloomy woodland felt wrong in a way that was hard to define, too quiet, too still. Even in early spring, these shadowed timberlands should have been alive with activity. Birds flitting between branches, squirrels gathering the last of the fall nuts, the occasional glimpse of larger animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, we walked through what felt like a museum diorama of a gloomy woodland. All the right elements in place, but lacking the spark of actual life. Rusty stayed unusually close throughout our search, often looking back the way we had come. His behavior reminded me of the endless dusk before, when he barked at something invisible in the darkness. Whatever had spooked him then seemed to be lingering in his mind, making him jumpy and alert. We continued north until we reached a small stream that marked the boundary of my property. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, but the bank showed none of the tracks that should have been there. No signs of animals coming to drink. No prints in the soft mud at the water's edge. I don't understand this, I murmured, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet gloomy woodland. Where did they all go? Rusty wed softly, his ears constantly moving, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. We turned east, following the stream for nearly a mile before cutting south again through a stand of old-growth maple trees. This had always been a good area for hunting. The mature trees producing acorns that attracted deer and smaller game. Now it stood empty and silent, the gloomy woodland floor undisturbed except for our own passing. As we moved back toward more familiar territory, I noticed Rusty's behavior becoming more erratic. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He would stop suddenly, staring into the trees with his hackles raised, then hurry to catch up with me, often looking behind as if expecting to see something following us. What is it, youth? I whispered during one such pause, what do you see? He gave no answer except to press against my leg before moving on, his body tense and alert. By late afternoon, we'd completed a wide loop north of the shack without finding any significant signs of recent animal activity. The gloomy woodland had become a desert despite its abundant vegetation and water sources. It made no sense from any natural perspective, I understood. As we approached the shack from the north, I found myself looking in the direction of the Monolith clearing, though it was miles away and hidden by trees. An idea had been forming in my mind throughout our fruitless search. A connection that seemed impossible, yet increasingly difficult to ignore. The monolith had appeared suddenly in a clearing I knew well. Shortly after its appearance, all wildlife began avoiding my traps. The gloomy woodland around the structure had fallen silent, devoid of the normal sounds of birds and small animals. And now we discovered that wildlife seemed to have abandoned a significant area of the gloomy woodland surrounding the monolith's location. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Somehow that black structure was driving away the local wildlife, creating an expanding zone of emptiness in the gloomy woodland. But how could an inanimate object, even one as strange and unexplainable as the monolith, affect animal behavior over such a wide area? Inside the shack, I pulled out my maps of the region and spread them across the table. Using a pencil, I marked the location of the monolith and then added notes about where we'd found the gloomy woodland particularly quiet or devoid of animal signs. A pattern emerged as I worked. The areas most affected seemed to radiate outward from the monolith in a rough circle. The further from the structure, the more normal the gloomy woodland seemed to be, though even at the farthest points of our search, wildlife activity had been notably diminished. Rusty sat beside me, watching as I worked. Unlike his usual relaxed posture in the shack, he remained alert, his head occasionally turning toward the windows as if tracking something outside. His anxiety was feeding my own unease, creating a feedback loop of tension that filled the small shack. "What is that thing?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. "What's it doing to the gloomy woodland?" Rusty wed softly, pressing his warm body against my leg. I stared at the map, trying to make sense of what was happening. In all my years living in these shadowed timberland, I'd never encountered anything that couldn't eventually be explained by natural processes. Unusual weather patterns, disease outbreaks among certain species, human activity from the park, all these things could temporarily affect wildlife behavior. But this was different. The appearance of the monolith and the subsequent changes in the gloomy woodland defied any natural explanation I could think of. Its perfect geometric shape, its sudden appearance without signs of transport or construction, and now its apparent effect on the surrounding ecosystem. None of it made sense. As darkness fell, I lit the kerosene lamps and stoked the fire in the stove. The familiar routine brought little comfort as my mind continued to circle around the problem of the monolith. Outside, the gloomy woodland had fallen into its nighttime oppressive stillness, but even that seemed wrong somehow. Too complete, too empty of the usual nocturnal sounds. Rusty refused to settle, moving restlessly from window to window, just as he had the previous endless dusk. His behavior added to my growing sense that something fundamental had changed in the gloomy woodland I'd called home for most of my life. Something that had begun with the appearance of that impossible black structure standing silent in a clearing that should have been empty. 2 days had passed since my fruitless search of the gloomy woodland. The maps I'd marked still lay on the kitchen table, a visual reminder of the unnatural emptiness spreading outward from the monolith. I'd checked the traps again that ashen dawn, still empty, still surrounded by an unnerving absence of wildlife. The pattern was beyond anything I could explain through natural causes or bad luck. Rusty had changed, too. The dog who once moved through the gloomy woodland with confidence, now flinched at shadows and pressed against my leg at the slightest noise. His behavior had grown increasingly erratic with each passing hour, as if something invisible to me was constantly demanding his attention. That ashen dawn, as I made coffee, Rusty had spent 20 minutes scratching at the eastern wall of the shack, whining and occasionally looking back at me as if expecting me to understand what troubled him. When I approached to check the wall, he backed away, hackles raised, before returning to continue his frantic scratching once I stepped aside. "There's nothing there, youth," I told him, running my hand over the rough wooden planks. The wall was solid, unchanged since my father had built it decades ago. Rusty disagreed. Something about that particular section of wall deeply disturbed him, though I could detect nothing unusual. By midday, his restlessness had only intensified. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He refused to venture more than a few yards from me when we stepped outside to gather more firewood. The confidence that had marked his movements through the gloomy woodland was gone, replaced by a nervous vigilance that kept his head constantly swiveling, ears pricked forward, then flattened against his skull in rapid succession. Most concerning were the moments when he would suddenly freeze, growling at empty spaces between trees or vacant patches of underbrush. His eyes would track something moving, following its progress with unwavering attention, though I could see nothing there but early spring dead leaves and bare branches. "What do you see?" I whispered after the third such incident, kneeling beside him as he growled at a perfectly ordinary stand of birch trees. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He gave no indication he'd heard me, his focus entirely on whatever phantom had captured his attention. Only when I gently touched his back did he startle and look at me, eyes wide with what I could only interpret as fear. Back inside the shack, I tried to distract us both with routine tasks. Cleaning my hunting rifles, organizing supplies, checking my dwindling food stores. Rusty remained unusually clingy, following so close behind me that I nearly tripped over him several times. Whenever I sat down, he pressed against my legs, his body vibrating with tension. By late afternoon, I'd given up on getting anything productive done. Rusty's anxiety had infected me, leaving my nerves raw and my attention fractured. I found myself pausing in the middle of simple tasks, listening for something I couldn't identify. The oppressive stillness outside the shack seemed to press against the windows like a physical force. As the early spring twilight descended, I began preparing dinner. A simple stew made from the last of my stored venison and dried vegetables. The familiar routine offered some comfort, and for a brief period, Rusty seemed to relax slightly, lying near the stove where the heat was strongest. I was just adding salt to the pot when it happened. Rusty exploded from his resting place, launching himself toward the kitchen window with a ferocity that knocked over a chair in his path. His barking was different from anything I'd heard before. Not the alert bark of a hunting dog or even the warning bark from nights earlier. This was frantic, desperate, filled with a primal fear that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I abandoned the stew and moved quickly to the window, peering out into the dim twilight. The small clearing around the shack lay empty and still. The trees at its edge, pitch-black silhouettes against the fading light. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. "What is it?" I whispered, pressing my face closer to the glass. "I don't see anything, Rusty." The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He continued barking. His front paws now up on the windowsill, body rigid with tension. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the treeline, something I couldn't perceive no matter how hard I strained my vision. I grabbed my rifle from its place by the door, more from habit than any clear intention. The weight of it in my hands offered little reassurance as Rusty's barking grew even more frantic. I considered stepping outside to investigate, but hesitated. Something about Rusty's reaction suggested that whatever was out there was better observed from behind the shack walls. For several minutes, this standoff continued. Rusty barking frantically at the window. Me standing beside him with my rifle. Both of us staring out at an apparently empty clearing. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Rusty stopped barking. The oppressive stillness that followed felt louder than his previous noise. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He backed away from the window, tail tucked between his legs, and scrambled under the kitchen table. There, he curled into a tight ball, his entire body trembling so violently that I could hear his nails clicking against the floor. I knelt beside the table. "Rusty, what's wrong, youth?" He raised his head slightly, eyes meeting mine, and the raw fear I saw there sent a chill through me. Whatever had frightened him was real, at least to him, and no amount of reassurance from me would convince him otherwise. The stew on the stove began to boil over, breaking the moment. I returned to the kitchen, moving the pot off the heat before looking once more out the window. The clearing remained empty, now fully embraced by endless dusk. I lit more kerosene lamps, their warm glow pushing back the darkness, but doing little to dispel the sense of wrongness that had settled over the shack. Rusty refused to come out from under the table, even when I set a bowl of stew near him. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He remained curled in a tight ball, eyes wide and watchful, tracking something I couldn't see as it apparently moved around the shack. After eating my own dinner with little appetite, I checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The endless dusk promised to be a long one, with Rusty in his current state and my own nerves frayed by the day's events. I tried to read for a while an old paperback I'd read many times before, but the words refused to hold meaning. My attention kept drifting to Rusty under the table and to the window where he'd seen or sensed something in the darkness. Eventually, I banked the fire in the stove and prepared for bed, though I had little expectation of actual sleep. Rusty followed me to the bedroom, still staying unnaturally close, and jumped onto the bed without waiting for an invitation. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He positioned himself against my legs, his body still trembling slightly. The shack creaked and settled around us as the temperature outside continued to drop. Familiar sounds that had never bothered me before now seemed loaded with potential meaning. I found myself listening too intently to each small noise, trying to determine if it was normal or something else. I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep because I woke suddenly completely alert. Rusty was pressed hard against my legs, his body rigid. In the darkness, I could feel him shaking. Then I heard it, a low humming sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere to the northeast. The direction of the monolith. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to capture the sound. It wasn't mechanical like an engine or generator. The pitch fluctuated subtly, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, but not quite recognizable. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, vibrating directly through the wooden walls of the shack and into my bones. The longer I listened, the more certain I became that the source was the black structure standing in that clearing. The sound matched the wrongness I'd felt when standing before it. Something that didn't belong in this world. Rusty wed softly beside me, his trembling increasing as the humming continued. I placed a hand on his side, feeling his rapid heartbeat through his ribs. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mist that carried faint whispers, as if the forest itself spoke, shadows twisting into shapes that almost looked human. He pressed closer, seeking comfort. I wasn't sure I could provide. The humming maintained its steady presence for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. I lay motionless the entire time, one hand on Rusty, the other gripping the edge of my blanket so tightly my fingers cramped. When the sound finally began to fade, the relief was short-lived. Its absence left a vacuum that seemed even more disturbing, a waiting oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.